Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful event. We've been looking forward to this for some time. So glad to see so many of you here. Looks like a lot of old friends in the audience and looks like some new friends as well. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And we've been doing these virtual programs on Crowdcast since last April. It seems impossible that it's been that long, but we've really been enjoying spending these evenings with you, and we're glad to be spending another evening with you tonight, particularly this evening. We'll talk more about what's happening tonight in just a moment. I want to introduce you to a few of the Crowdcast features for those of you who are not maybe familiar with Crowdcast, which I'm assuming most of you are not. I see you've already availed yourselves of the chat, which is awesome. So continue, please, to chat among yourselves throughout the program and share your thoughts and make new friends there. But we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the program. So if you have a question for one of the speakers, please put it in that Ask a Question section that you see down at the bottom of your screen. There's already one question there, so please add to that. And that's where we'll be turning for questions when we come to that part of the program. So if you really want your question posed, don't put it in the chat, just put it in that Ask a Question area. So thank you for that. Another thing I'm going to direct your attention to, if I may, is that long green bar that's under my face right now that says, "Your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here." So just real quickly, I want to tell you that the Mark Twain House and Museum is a private nonprofit organization. Our primary source of revenue is our guided house tour. And while we're very excited that we're going to be open for that in a couple weeks now and welcoming people in person to tour the house, we have been without that source of revenue that is so important to us for most of the past year. And the donations that we receive in conjunction with these public programs have been vitally important to us and continue to be so. So we know that the COVID crisis has been tough on everybody, but let me just tell you, on behalf of the entire staff and the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, any little bit or any big bit that you might be able to share with us is deeply appreciated and put to very, very good use. So, including continuing to be able to offer these programs, which I know a lot of you have found really valuable and pleasant during this time. So do what you can, if you will. So we have tons and tons of programs coming up. I think that we have one every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night through the middle of May. I won't take time now to rattle those off for you, but please do visit our website, marktwainhouse.org, to learn more about all of those. And we hope to see you in the audience for many of those. I also want to mention that we are selling copies, signed copies of the book that we're talking about tonight, Lolita in the Afterlife, through our museum store. So again, when you purchase through our store, we know you have other options for sure, but when you do make the purchase through our store, you do get a signed copy, and then you also have the benefit of knowing that you're supporting the museum. And I hope you'll feel good about that. I believe we're also selling copies of Lolita itself. So I hope that you'll also take advantage of the opportunity to purchase that from us too. Hope you can see that. So I don't want to stay on screen too much longer because we have wonderful guests tonight, and let me introduce them to you. Some of them have been to the museum before. Sloane Crosley is the author of the new collection, Look Alive Out There, the novel The Clasp, and the best-selling essay collections, How Did You Get This Number? And I Was Told There'd Be Cake, which was a finalist for the Thurber Prize for American Humor. Love to welcome her back. She came and spoke with us a couple of years ago right in our auditorium, and we hope she'll come back to do that again as soon as possible. Dani Shapiro is also a repeat visitor. She's the author of the instant New York Times best-selling memoir, Inheritance. The memoirs Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, and 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. In 2019, she launched an original podcast called Family Secrets in collaboration with iHeartMedia. It's an iTunes Top 10 podcast featuring stories from guests who, like Dani, have uncovered life-altering and long-hidden secrets from their family's past. So welcome back, Dani. A newcomer for us tonight, Jamie Loftus, is a comedian, Emmy-nominated TV writer, and creator of the Lolita podcast, a feminist and survivor-focused documentary series about Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov and all its, as she writes, crummy adaptations. So welcome, Jamie. And our moderator this evening is Bridget Quinn, President and CEO of Hartford Public Library and a trustee of the Mark Twain House and Museum. So, Bridget, thank you for doing this for us tonight. So all of you are guests of honor, but our main guest of honor is Jenny Minton Quigley. She's a writer and editor, series editor for the Best Short Stories of the Year, the O. Henry Prize winners, and the author of a memoir, The Early Birds. She's the daughter of Walter J. Minton, the storied former president and publisher of G.P. Putnam's Sons, who first dared to publish Lolita in the United States in 1958. So we're so thrilled to have all of you here this evening. I am going to invite our guests on screen, and I'm going to leave. I'll see you all back at the question and answer. So welcome. It takes a moment to get everybody up here, so be patient, please. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, how are you, Jennifer?
I'm so good. Thank you for being here. Here's everybody coming on. Hi, Bridget and Dani.
Hi, Jennifer.
Okay, so this one is confusing. The Tuesday agency is actually Sloane Crosley.
Hi.
And then Jamie Loftus is coming up now. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to sit back and enjoy like everybody else, and I'll see you at the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jennifer. Welcome, ladies. It's so nice to be with you here this evening. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And never let it be said that we take on easy topics. This is a big one with a lot of serious, meat to the discussion. So I'm looking forward to really digging in. Jennifer referred to this, she gave a little foreshadowing in her introduction, but you have a very personal connection to this book, to Nabokov's book, that you introduce really compellingly in the introduction to your book, Lolita in the Afterlife. So for those who may not know about your personal connection, could you give us a little bit of an overview of why you're bringing this to us now?
Yes, of course, Bridget. I don't think many people do know about my family's connection to Lolita. And if you give me just a few minutes, I'd love to explain it, and I hope it won't bore you. But my family's connection to Lolita starts in 1901 with my grandfather, who is the son of a fisherman, and at 15 years old, gets on a ferry in Red Bank, New Jersey, to go to Wall Street and get his first job to help support his sisters and his family. And instead, he gets off at the wrong stop in Midtown Manhattan and gets a job in the stockroom at Scribner's publishing house. He works his way up for many years at Scribner's, moves over to Putnam's, becomes the sales manager. And then George Putnam, the owner, leaves Putnam's in bankruptcy, almost in bankruptcy, to go and find his wife who has disappeared. And her name is Amelia Earhart. So the company's in bankruptcy. My grandfather and a partner take it over for a song, and they're able to publish memoirs by Teddy Roosevelt and the Duke of Windsor. And my father goes to work for Putnam's. And about 10 years later, my grandfather died of a stroke. And my father, at a very young age, 30 years old, 1955, takes over Putnam's. My father was young, he was brash, he didn't really care what people thought of him that much, and he was going to change this company. And he was going to start changing this company by taking some risks. The first book he bought was by Norman Mailer, was The Deer Park. 5 major publishers had rejected it. Bennett Cerf, who is still on my Random House boxes, he was the head of Random House, and Bennett Cerf called my father and said, "Walter, you'll bring down the thin veil of censorship if you publish Norman Mailer." And so, that made him want to even more. So we published Norman Mailer, and then in 1955, from a friend named Rosemary, he heard about this book called Lolita. Lolita had been rejected all over New York City. It had been also to all 5 publishers. The publisher of Viking Press said, if we publish this thing, we're going to go to jail. It was the Eisenhower era. McCarthyism was just winding down. Writers were being prosecuted. Publishers had been prosecuted. And so everyone was scared. And my father wrote a letter to he stayed up all night reading it. It was a small, you'll probably all remember the green Olympia Press edition. It's kind of famous now. And 5,000 copies in France have been published by the Olympia Press. So my dad writes this letter to Nabokov, sends it up to Ithaca, saying, being a rather backward example of a backward American publisher, I've just heard of this book, Lolita, and I'd like to come talk to you about it. And then my brother and sister and I used to hear as kids how my dad, it was like Casablanca. He got on a plane in the middle of the night. It was a DC-3 airliner, and he flew through a storm to Ithaca, New York, where the Nabokovs were like teaching English. Vladimir was teaching English, but he got there and he negotiated this deal to publish Lolita. He had to get the copyright out of. He had to please both Gerodius at the Olympia Press and the Nabokovs, and he was able to do this. They published it as exactly what I said. The book 5 publishers were afraid to bring you. They blasted ads that had both positive reviews and also reviews from the New York Times saying highbrow pornography. And Lolita went on to sell more books in the first 3 weeks than any novel ever sold. It sold more than Gone with the Wind. It sold 100,000 copies, which at that time was astronomical. And the issue of the day that I just wanted to get to quickly is that the issue of the day that what he was fighting in the 50s was censorship, obscenity laws. And then there was this period of like 60 years when I read Lolita where it was art. I was taught Nabokov and Lolita was art. And now I feel like we're in this moment again. Here we are almost 65 years later where Lolita is having another reckoning. And it's not censorship this time. It's not pornography. It's more about triggering. And it's triggering and how do we read it today? There's still an awful lot of young people reading it. It's popular on Amazon. It's still being taught. But how we feel about this novel and how we talk about it today.
Absolutely. So thank you for that introduction. It is fascinating. I loved reading that part. And as a librarian, you can imagine, censorship is something that it's a topic that I think a lot about. And it's one that I actually have to consider in a professional capacity fairly often when it comes to selecting materials or ensuring that, somebody's not being denied the opportunity to hold a program or, speak whatever their opinions are. So it's a huge responsibility that takes a lot of connection to your community and also knowing your audience. And what I'm going to pose to all of you at this point too is to think about this notion of censorship versus triggering and how that discussion has evolved over time. Is there ever a time when a perspective should be restricted or revisited? And it also makes me think of what's happening now in other areas, right, of publishing, including Dr. Seuss. The Random House recently decided that they're no longer going to publish a number of his titles. And that, of course, has led to a lot of discussions in the library world about whether or not we should remove those titles. So it does seem that there are nuanced discussions of censorship, as you alluded to, Jenny. So I'd be interested, Sloane, why don't you weigh in here and let us know what you think the challenges or the opportunities for discussion about censorship in light of trigger warnings, and is it art, is it obscenity? Would be fascinated to hear your perspective.
I just think it'd be kind of funny to do like a Russian doll effect right now in which I just said, burn all books, and that was the trigger warning just within itself. Well, first of all, to touch briefly, because it's not what we're here for, but on the Dr. Seuss thing, I think that is, there's obviously a reductive quality. It's a children's book, and it's also intentional. If you see the ones that were banned, they are fully extremely racist. They're really like the characters are like little Asian men and with chopsticks and rice hats, and they are actually yellow. There are things that are just sort of like egregious, and they're also hitting a different audience, a younger audience, presumably less sophisticated, depending on your child, than you reading Lolita. But so that one is it's like, for me, it's interesting to hear it. For me, that's separate. But for Lolita, in terms of trigger warnings, I think, on the whole, I think we've gone too far because I don't think it's subtle enough. There's something about Lolita. No one reads Lolita and thinks, oh, well, he explained it. Good. Now I get it. Thank you for explaining this. I now no longer have an issue with this relationship. I don't think there's a messed up power dynamic. Everything's fine. So I feel like for me, it is, and I say this in my essay, I think I call it the most lyrical novel of the century. I mean, I feel like there's a baby bathwater thing with it. I mean, it's commenting on something where there's a different kind of discussion now where we talk about separating the artist from the art and all that. And I don't know, I'm kind of a proponent of that. And I don't know if that sort of reveals all the rings on my tree trunk, that I'm supposed to be maybe a little bit sort of millennial in my thinking. But I just think that making something go away so that you don't have to have a hard discussion about it is not as good as having a hard discussion about it.
Yeah. Dani, what are you thinking? And you had a very interesting statement in your essay about trigger warnings.
Well, I was actually at that moment thinking about something that Sloane just said, and there's this phrase at the end of her essay in the anthology, which I really love, which is, and it has to do with, I think, I mean, what does it mean for a book to endure in this way? Like what, I often say to my students, there are only 4 kinds of, possibilities for writers. There's fame when they're alive, fame when they're dead, fame when they're alive, obscurity when they're dead. Some people might be okay with that. Obscurity when you're alive, fame when you're dead, which would be sad, but maybe better. And then obscurity, which of course is the saddest thing of all. But, the fact that we are here talking about this, the fact that, that this book continues to be read and grappled with. There's this moment in Sloane's essay where whether we produce transcendent works of transcendent art or total schlock, the truest tribute we can offer this novel is to remain forever in a suspension of discomfort. And that's what speaks to the trigger warning and the banning is, is it not okay to be uncomfortable? What is it to kind of like sit in that discomfort? And I think in my essay, what you're referring to is that it moves from, I probably would have been taught Lolita by my high school English teacher as the greatest love story ever told. And, certainly in the light of another phrase that I've recently really become very fond of, which is retrospective moral judgment. We can look at that from where we sit today and say, well, that's, really probably not the best way to teach Lolita. But there is this grappling that seems extremely valuable to me. How do we, and I'm showing the rings on my tree trunk too, but how do we form ourselves and our thinking if we aren't able to have a discourse and be uncomfortable and interrogate texts.
Right. Yeah, and that's really interesting. And Jamie, one of the things I really love your podcast, and it's there's so much. It's incredible how much detail is in there and how many different perspectives that you bring in to help analyze the text as well as all of the other issues. So one of the episodes that I was thinking about in light of this discussion is how Lolita is taught now. And I think one of the guests that you had on your podcast, Allison Wood, she teaches it in a really creative way. And maybe you can give a little bit of detail about that.
Yeah, Allison was so wonderful to kind of share her perspective on how she has changed the way the book is taught, because I totally agree with what you're saying, Dani, is that I think that so much of the reputation of this book has to do with how it's been kind of framed to us, where, we can say the first time we read Lolita, we're going in completely like in the dark, but the cover says it's a love story. And if you're not if you read it when you're very young, that is something that is going to hit for you before you kind of begin to read. And there are very few covers that don't allude to that. in some way. So I do think you're not going in completely cold, even if you would like to be. And what I love that Allison does is that she kind of just discusses with her students before she begins teaching it what their preconceptions of the book are, and makes it clear that from her perspective, it isn't a love story, and that she kind of does, I think some of the work that gets kind of frustrating is like having to argue against the cover of the book you're about to teach. But that's what she does, and she has them only read a certain amount, a certain section of the book. She only has them read the first part, and they kind of discuss it as a group. They talk about their impressions. They're kind of allowed to throw out, devil's advocate, takes, and kind of this like cool collaborative space, and figure it out together. And I thought that was a really cool approach to teaching it, instead of just saying, I agree with the cover, now let's start. Because I think that kind of sets you up for failure with this book in particular.
Yeah, thanks. So Jenny, let's go back to you and thinking about how this came together. So you could have created a work revisiting Lolita in a lot of different ways, and yet you chose to put together a compilation of essays from very, very impressive contributors, two of whom are here this evening. Can you speak a little bit about the process that you went through putting this together? What essays really surprised you, or any unique things that you'd like to share with us about how this book came together?
Okay, so the biggest surprise for me of all putting together this collection is that all the contributors I asked said yes. And that was amazing. I mean, I don't know, here's the book. It's pretty big. It's more than 400 pages. And I never in my wildest dreams thought everyone would say yes, but everyone did think it was time to talk about Lolita. So that was the best, most exciting surprise. The reason I decided to frame it as a book is because I'm a reader. I've just discovered podcasts thanks to Jamie's Lolita podcast, and Dani has this great podcast, Family Secrets, that launches again tomorrow. And I have also discovered audiobooks by listening to the contributors read their Lolita essays, but for the most part, I'm a reader. And I thought that writers would be the best able together to express different points of view, because what surprised me again and again with the anthology is there are no two alike points. I was worried. So Jen Marshall, who's my agent, she and I collaborated, and it was really her idea. We were talking about a piece that Rand Richards Cooper, who's from Hartford, wrote in the New Yorker about Lolita, and she said, we need an anthology. We'd both read a Caitlin Flanagan piece in the Atlantic, and she said, you're going to edit it. So I listened to her, and we were worried that 20, 30 essays about the same novel might be boring, so we started coming up with ideas for topics for people. So Sloane Crosley, who I'm looking at right now, she obviously was pop culture, right? And you have to talk about the poster. So she was pop culture, but there were other ideas like Lolita fashion. There's a Japanese subculture, and Jen thought of Robin Given. She was the fashion critic at the Washington Post. Now she's a critic at large. She wrote a brilliant piece. Stacy Schiff jumped in very early on, and she helped come up with ideas too. She said, well, Lolita's always been an on-the-road novel. They drive across the country, all these motels in the 1950s that don't exist today. And I'm pretty sure she was the one who even thought of Ian Fraser to write that piece. And he was perfect. I mean, he knows Nabokov in St. Petersburg and those motels. And at one point he realizes that they could have crossed paths in a hotel, his family in their station wagon, and Nabokov and Vera, catching butterflies, could have crossed paths at this motel, out in the Midwest in the summer. So that was amazing. And then we just came up with different ideas and pitched them to the writers. And another surprise, last one, is that all the pieces that came in were surprising, and they were all different. But one that was particularly surprising is I had pitched to Cheryl Strayed to write a letter Dear Lolita from Sugar. You know, she has an advice column that's called Dear Sugar. And so I said, why don't you write a letter, Dear Lolita from Sugar, and give her some of your wonderful advice. And what she did was she wrote a letter to Sugar from Lolita instead, from Dolores, and created her voice. I can't even quite explain what it felt like when Lolita's voice came down, you know, on the page. Finally, she really channeled it. I thought that was surprising. And I also thought because Dani and her mother, when that piece came in, was so honest. And I have a relationship. My mother's the kind of person who's like, you're prettier, you're smarter, you know. So it never occurred to me that Charlotte Hayes, as the mother, would have influenced, you know, the way that Dolores became, right? Dolores was competing for men. And so that was, I had never thought of that before.
Yeah. And so Dani, why don't we follow up on that? Because I think what, you know, I underlined and highlighted so many essays, but one of the ones I definitely underlined from yours, Dani, is, you know, Lolitas are made, not born. And I think, you know, how you framed your essay about, you know, identifying with Dolores because of her fraught relationship with her mother and your personal experience was incredibly moving and emotional. So do you want to give a little bit about what your contribution is in the book?
Absolutely. I mean, I think something that's instructive about my contribution is that, you know, I said yes immediately when Jenny first, as everyone else did, when Jenny first invited me to contribute, because I saw it as such an opportunity to grapple with and reread Lolita and think about it. But then life happened and a long time went by, and I kept on. I was reading it, but I kept on feeling very like I'm not sure what my, you know, unlike some of the others, Jenny didn't come to me with, you know, this is, you know, just, it was basically like read it and see what you want to write about. And then COVID-19 hit, and I was home, as we all were, those of us who could be. And in the quiet and in the stillness, at first I thought, I've got nothing. I really thought this is going to be the first time I've ever accepted an assignment I really wanted to do and have to pretty much, I think I wrote to Jenny and said, I can't. I'm sorry, I can't. And Jenny, like the great editor that she is, very gently wrote back, you know, this, allowing us to let that be okay if I really can't. But, you know, there is this, I keep thinking about your mother and your relationship with your mother and Charlotte Hayes, and a light bulb just went off for me. And also because I was in this like deeply like fraught and slow and quiet time. I mean, I don't know about all of you and everyone who's listening, but the feeling I had very much during those early months of the pandemic was there was so much vulnerability, and there was also a sense of like ghosts sort of started appearing. You know, there was just enough quiet and enough slowness that I really did start, like my mother just, she's been gone a long time and we had a really difficult relationship. She sort of materialized. And as I was thinking about and rereading, I realized that Charlotte Hayes envied Lolita. Her sense of, you know, it's such an unnatural thing for a mother to be competitive with her daughter in that way. And it's there on the page, and I had never really registered that before. And then I found myself thinking about my own relationship with my mother, who was very competitive with me and envious of me. And I think as a child or a girl of that age, to feel that envy, not be able to put language to it, you know, not be able to articulate it in any kind of conscious way, but has its own strange power to it, because there's a feeling of, well, if you're being envied, there must be something to be envied for, and yet all of the self-loathing and guilt that goes along with that, the very, very complicated mixed messages. So I really wanted to try to unpack that.
Yeah, it was very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. And I think in that vein of, Lolita's being made, not born, there's the cultural piece of that too, right? So there's the way that your family and people that you know impact you, but there's also the greater context of our cultural society. And I think, Sloane, you addressed this a little bit, saying that you spent your childhood in a distinctly Humberty time, which I did too as a teen in the 80s. I mean, I think back of those cultural icons of the time, especially in, film, but literature too, but specifically film, like any John Hughes film, definitely
Right.
The Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I mean, all of those are about young teen and teen sexuality and their exploits. And when I look back and watch them now, it's cringy, right? It's just like nothing that we would portray now. But you can see, as you pointed out in your essay, how that became a way that girls can think about themselves. So can you talk just a little bit about what you included in your essay as far as that cultural piece of how Lolita's impacted I'll stop there and let you talk.
According to Dani, how are they made?
Yes, exactly.
Well, one thing on the John Hughes note, I would say there's also a great Molly Ringwald essay that she wrote for the New Yorker at some point about sort of her complicated relationship with John Hughes and being in the movies. But I mean, I think now I can't imagine, there's such a boys will be boys vibe that is so much later. Like, we like to think of ourselves, however advanced we are when we talk about sort of, gender and autonomy and all of this stuff. We like to think that, like, however we are, we've been this way for, like, I don't know, just put a number on it, like 15 years. No. There's such I think now if they were to make like a movie of Lolita now, like a film adaptation, for instance, I think that just it would be almost like that Humbert is just this uncontrollable figure, and we don't forgive him the way we would have in the in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It's not like Roman Polanski time, but we're just like, you have to defend yourself against this scumbag because he's going to exist no matter what. And I think now the onus is much more, we read it partially because of the dynamic, but now we read it and think it's just not working. Like, the explanation is not working anymore. But I think that the way that my essay is sort of structured, and I think what's interesting about Lolita and a sort of funky testament to its endurance in the culture is that it didn't get sort of bastardized right away. It happened very slowly. Where with the Kubrick, his film, and then the Adrian Lyne version, and then between that you have the photograph, the art for it, where he gets younger and she gets older as it goes on, until like the body double for Dominique Swain in the Adrian Lyne version, which is a sentence I did not think I was going to say when I woke up this morning, is like 21 years old or something like that, or 19 or something, where like she's just, we keep trying to make it more palatable, and then what becomes disturbing is we take that palatability, if that's a word, and we turn it into sex with pop music, basically, with Katy Perry and Lana Del Rey. Lana Del Rey is very interesting to me, which I won't go on too much about the panel, but she's very interesting just because in the essay I basically say it's the difference between Protestantism, I can't speak this evening, I apologize, and Catholicism with transubstantiation, right? Where like I think Katy Perry or Taylor Swift, even her early work, or Miley Cyrus, they think it's the symbol of Lolita in the lyrics, whereas Katy Perry feels like she's swallowed the wafer and thinks that this is now who she is, in a very major way. And so I don't know, it's just been interesting to watch it slowly happen, because people were scandalized, if they felt that it was just sort of a sexy book with a cool cover, as you were saying, that like it wouldn't have been banned,
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I could just go on about Katy Perry for a while, but
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the film versions too, because Jamie, I think that's something that you've dealt with pretty, regularly or often in your podcast, is thinking about how the film versions differ so much from the actual writing. Do you want to give a little bit of a background on that?
Yeah, that was kind of a bleak rabbit hole to go down, because it was tricky to find production details about how those movies are made, and I know that a lot of people have strong attachments to them. When I was a teenager, I watched the 1997 Adrian Lyne version like in 10 parts on YouTube, and that is still a culture that very much exists. At any given time in the past 15 years, teenage girls have been watching that Lolita movie on YouTube, and it affects them. But what I was interested in when I was working on those episodes in particular was trying to figure out how the men, it was always men who were put in charge of adapting this story, how they viewed the subject matter, right? Because if you go in with a faulty idea of who Humbert Humbert is, of course the fallout, no matter what happens in terms of production restrictions or editing or anything like that, if you start on the wrong foot, it's going to end up not great. And so with Kubrick's movie, there's a lot in that production that made it very clear that it was kind of a pro-Humbert text going into it, which is fascinating because, Nabokov was involved in the writing of that movie. He was credited with the final screenplay, but barely a word that he wrote actually appears on screen. The whole movie ended up being written by Stanley Kubrick and his producer, James Harris, who, according to some incredible reporting done by Sarah Weinman, who wrote a great essay in Lolita in the Afterlife, who raped the star of the movie, Sue Lyon. And so, from the jump at the beginning of the adaptations, it is very, very clear that the way that Dolores's character is viewed by the people making it is not very generous or empathetic towards her really at all. And so you see her kind of framed in the way that Humbert frames her, rather than, doing the work of a filmmaker and trying to get past what your protagonist is telling you. And that shows up again and again in the like very cursed Broadway musical from the 70s, which I almost recommend listening to because it's got it is catchy, but it's gross. But and then the 1997 version, Adrian Lyne was super passionate about making this movie. But if you listen to his director's commentary, it couldn't be clearer that he has a faulty understanding of who Humbert Humbert is, I think, based on the kinds of conversations we'd be having now. And so what I kind of walked away with is, even when you have artists with the best of intentions, which not all of them did, but some of them did, I think it does matter to have the correct people in the room and talk to people, and not just assume that your personal read, as a man who has a lot more in common with Humbert Humbert than the title of the film you're making. You can't just assume that you read it and you're like, got it, cool, love it, and then just start shooting. There are so many factors to this story, and none of them ever center Dolores, or even try to. And that, I feel like, is kind of something that now is retroactively being done, of hold on, that's, no one in this girl's life even calls her Lolita. This is all such a constructed narrative, which, we realize, but if you see a movie before you read the book, which I know is the case for many young people right now who read Lolita, they've seen the movie that's up for free on YouTube, and the movie that's up for free on YouTube very much is not invested in who Dolores actually is. It's more invested in Humbert's perception of her, and I think that it just gets so messy, and that. Yeah, that the movies are not good is what I'm saying.
Thank you. But it's interesting. I think, one of the things that I think that our discussion tonight and your book, Jenny, brings up is that it almost gives us the opportunity to give Dolores her voice back, right? And I think that that's the power of you bringing this back to the forefront for us in discussion. And Sloane, do you want to weigh in on that? Well, I know we have to get to audience questions in a second, but I feel like you're just at the tip of the iceberg.
It's a quick one. And Jenny will know the answer to this. What's the ratio of women versus men writing about Lolita in this book?
I was so much more interested in what women had to say.
I don't know.
I just thought that men might need to edit themselves a little more right now.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Like Tom Bissell chose to write about the movies. I think women are more comfortable sort of shouting about this book right now.
Yeah.
And what they can explore.
Well, yeah, and that's an important perspective. I mean, to Jamie's point, so much of the review of this book in the past has been by men. So it's high time that women have a little bit more opportunity to discuss it.
And also sort of what, piggybacking on what Jamie said, I read in the New York Times about these book talks, which of course Jamie knows all about, but I didn't. They're TikToks, which my kids won't let me go on TikTok, but they're the videos. The book talks are these young, mostly women, reading passages of Lolita. And, the sales of Lolita, if our book sells as well as Lolita, we're in really good shape. So it's important now to steer the conversation a little bit with, again, what I think you're all saying, Dolores at the center, right?
Dolores at the center.
Is with Dolores at the center. How if you made a movie, it would have to be by a female director and producer and team, I think. I thought Claire Dieter said something really interesting in her essay, which is that she couldn't bond with any character when she read Lolita, but she could bond with the silence, the absence of Lolita's voice. And that's another way to talk about it today. And I guess, well, go on.
Well, I feel like we're about 40 minutes in, and I see that there's a few questions in the chat. So I want to ask Jennifer to come back in and help us and kind of facilitate the audience questions. Here she is. Welcome back.
It took a moment for me to get on. Thank you. Oh my goodness, what a fascinating discussion. Thank you all. My head is spinning, and I can't wait to finish reading your book, Jenny. We do have some audience questions, and I have one of my own, but I'll go to the audience first. And please, if you have not posted your question yet, please do so, because we have a few minutes devoted to this. So Anne Kurtz was the first one, Kuntz was the first to post a question. I don't see Lolita as a love story. HH doesn't have her best interests at heart, and Lolita doesn't love him. Please enlighten. I've been trying to figure this out for a long time. Thanks. Anybody want to jump in on that?
I agree. I think I've heard a number of kind of perspectives on people who read the book for the first time and are like, how has it ever been framed this way? Like, that makes absolutely no sense to me. And most of them are either women or survivors of sexual abuse who recognize some of the dynamics at play and the pressures at play in the book. I mean, it's so strange. I think that it does come a lot from my perspective of just how the work has been framed to us for so long. Where I feel like even a couple years ago, it would have seemed like you were being a real contrarian by arguing that this book was very clearly not a love story and says so, pretty quickly.
I think Mary Gateskill is someone in the book who just redefines love. Like, obviously this is obsession. Obviously it's rape. It's not love, like healthy love. But in her piece, Mary does say that on reading Lolita, I loved it in part because I was deeply satisfied and even comforted by its rare acknowledgement of the awful complexity of the human relationship to beauty and evil, normality and evil, and even to love and evil. So I guess, if there's a moment of empathy on that hill for Humbert Humbert when he realizes what he's done to Dolores, that he has just destroyed her life, maybe that's a kind of love if she can understand it. It's certainly not a romance. It's not a love story. And I would say, 29 out of 30 or 28 out of 30 essayists don't think it's a love story at all.
Yeah. Roxane Gay addressed it in her essays as well. She said, Humbert's narration is so plaintive, so earnest, that if you forced yourself to forget the details of his obsession, you might think this was a beautiful love story. So, yeah, I think.
And there's also like a scrim in between. Like, I think what you're suggesting and what Mary is sort of suggesting is like the opening is that it is a love story, but the object of affection is not Lolita. It's his own passions, his own obsessions, his only way that he feels like he can love. Even the beginning when he talks about Annabelle, like, you know, this, it's almost like she is like a host monkey for what he thinks of as love, and she gets caught in the crossfire. So, I mean, you can sort of look at it that way. Still, I still don't think it's a love story, but like, I suppose you can be in love with your own pathologies, which he is.
I'm not exactly sure how to articulate this, but I wonder too, you know, in the initial years of it being framed that way, whether it had something to do with just a kind of like a kind of misconstruing and not understanding like the language itself. You know, the prose is so gorgeous that I suppose that there might have been this possibility of just being kind of carried along by it, and sort of skating along in a certain way on its, you know, on the sheer sort of I don't want to say it is beautiful, but just the nature of it. Does anybody know what I mean? I'm having a hard time articulating it, but I just wonder whether the language.
It's romantic. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it was
linguistically romantic.
Yeah, and maybe that sort of stood in for this must be a love story because of this language.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps if it was any other writer but Nabokov, it wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
But also,
construed as a love story.
I wondered over, you know, if I could just go back to the 50s, because in Iraq now, you know, Zainab Salbi has the piece in the book about how in Iraq, you know, 12-year-old girls get married. Their fathers marry them off, and you know, and if they're raped, it's the girl who's shamed. You know, so in different cultures, I wish I could know whether, you know, when my dad's passed away, I wish I could know whether in the 50s, did they read this straight as a love story? You know, it was always Vera who was saying, don't forget the girl, don't forget the girl.
Yeah, but I don't think it would have been, you wouldn't label Romeo and Juliet as a love story. I mean, there's certain...
Lionel Trilling did. Lionel Trilling compared Juliet to Lolita. Yes. He said Lolita was like Juliet.
I mean, Juliet's much more dramatic.
And Romeo's the same age. So.
Yeah, there's that too. But no, the love story is, in a way now, it's funny how we use it now. Like when I see novels now that have a love story or whatever it is, or there's an amazing Russell Banks short story. It's one of my favorites called Sarah Cole, a type of love story. And it's about a very beautiful man who falls in love with a very homely woman, and there's sort of mutual fascination, and that they're at the extreme ends of the attraction spectrum. But the point is that it's not the hallmark love story that you think you're going to get. And so I think that there must have been a little piece of it. Maybe now it's used almost as a comedy trope to be like a love story between like this lamp and this pile of cheese. You know what I mean? Like, ha ha ha. You know, there must have been a shred of that in the 50s where they're like, they know it's not a straightforward love story. I don't think that the audience was like, oh, okay, I get it. Everything's forgiven because he was in love when he was obsessed. Anyway.
Wow. We could talk about that all night. We do have a couple of other questions, and I'm going to go back. So Tiana has asked a question related to movie adaptations, and we've talked about that a little bit. But so I'm going to kind of reframe the question and ask you all, your ideal, who would you have direct a new film version of Lolita, and who would you have star in this film?
Sophia Coppola.
Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Oh, nice.
Oh, yeah, good.
That's really good.
Write a scene, but she's busy.
I would love to see an animated version of this story. That's kind of what I feel like could be the most, and just like hearing the horror stories of how the actresses who played her had been, like what they'd been subjected to. I was like, oh, animation could actually be like the more like the safest route. And also I think would be, I can't think of like a specific animator, but like a female animator being in charge of a project like that, I think would be so amazing.
Amazing. And also maybe some of the history could even be addressed in a kind of interesting way.
Yeah, totally.
You
heard it here first, folks. Watch this
your real body, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our friend Ted Whittemore, trustee, writes, if Lolita was written in 2020 and published in 2021, what would the reaction be? Would it sell 100,000 copies immediately? Any one of you can jump right in.
It's beautiful. This is the thing. The whole thing is it's so beautiful.
I've been dying for this question. So thank you, Ted. And I would love to hear what you guys think. Okay, but Dan Franklin said a couple of years ago at the London Book Fair that Lolita could never be published today. That there would be a walkout, and that it absolutely couldn't happen. And Laura Waddell, who I don't know, but she runs a small publishing company in England, she said, she rebutted it, and she said, it's a rather fitting novel for an era when we are exploring the nuances of power and speaking up about sexual abuse more openly. Perhaps today's readers will understand it more than ever before. So I wonder, I mean, it would have to be such a smart publication, but with so many people saying it wouldn't be possible, I wonder if it might. And I'd be curious what you guys think.
Yeah.
So we're saying this novel as is published today.
For brand new.
I think it would be as successful. Honestly, I think in light of what's happened over the last few years, it would have a completely different entrance into, the world. But I think it would find its reader, and it would be as successful. I mean, because
it would have a better cover.
It would have a better cover.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like what would probably be different is just the way that like that book wouldn't be marketed in the same way it was in the 1950s. It wouldn't be presented to people in the same way it was. But the prose, like, I mean, it really, really holds up. And I think that if it was, presented in a particular way, that it would do super well. And it's not like it was easy to get published the first time. So it would probably still be hard, but it definitely could be done.
It would take a risk taker again, I think. I mean, I couldn't do it. I'm such a chicken. But it would take someone who was a risk taker. Seriously.
There was a book that came out about 4 years ago, maybe, called My Absolute Darling, that got a ton of press. That I think was a father-daughter incest relationship. She's slightly older. Either way, not good. But I don't know if it has legs in that same way. You'll pardon the phrasing. Just because I don't think it was as beautiful. I mean, this is the thing is there is something, the difficulty of Lolita is that the writing itself, maybe you think it, maybe you wish it had less adjectives. Some people call it purple, but I think it's bulletproof. And that's the difficulty, is that the topic is not. But the writing is so wonderful. So
I find myself wondering what would happen to the author if it were published today.
Wow.
I'm feeling sort of agita for because we're living.
Twitter happened to the author.
Schiff Stacy Schiff also says, how come Nabokov didn't think of publishing it under a female pseudonym? He wanted to publish it under a pseudonym, but she and Roxane Gay asked that too. Like, what if it was he had published it as a woman author?
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone would believe it.
Well, if he still had Vera around, I think that would be helpful, right? Like he'd have to take her on the book tours with him.
I know, and I think of Susan Choi calling it a moral hazard. That the way that Humbert does seduce you into his story, and she left her backpack on the subway platform when she was reading it, so she was totally seduced. But she does call it a moral hazard, So you'd have to be the kind of publisher who can put your name on that or off.
Yeah.
Well, I know we only have another minute or maybe 4 minutes, but I want to make sure we have one more question from Claire, and I hope I can ask my question too. Our audience member Claire says, after listening to Jamie's podcast, thank you, Jamie, and reading My Dark Vanessa, I'm reckoning with my own past in boarding school and the inappropriate relationships there. What, if anything, do you think about the romanticization of the teacher-student relationship and the use of Lolita as a grooming tool? That's a big question for the end of the program.
I loved My Dark Vanessa. I know Kate Elizabeth Russell has like an incredible essay in the book about her experience on online Lolita forums, which is like this whole other thing. But I didn't honestly realize before I started working on the podcast how Lolita specifically was used as a grooming tool and kind of taking advantage of this clear predatory relationship as a love story, as an excuse to prey on a student or someone in a position of lesser power. I think that is like a very real issue that there's been kind of like a shocking number of examples of. And I think that is something that can be combated by not by refusing to address that subject, but by just, showing that there is more than one perspective on it. And I know that this series was kind of polarizing, but the newer series, A Teacher, that I think is on FX, that kind of clearly demonstrates a predatory relationship and shows the perspective of the student and how it, there's so many gender dynamics involved, depending on the gender of kind of the underage prey and all these different ways of, if you're pursued as a young girl, you are like a slut. If you're pursued as a young man, you are this like very virile, cool guy that cannot be allowed to feel uncomfortable with exploitation of those dynamics. And I think that it's just like something that, entertainment is uniquely qualified to tackle in a way that is like engaging and interesting. And I think Lolita does that. It's just, that seems to me more of like a taking advantage of its reputation rather than like of the text itself.
Yeah, I would add to that Alison Wood's being Lolita as another example of grooming using the text, the teacher doing the grooming doesn't even know how to pronounce Nabokov, so he's it's his favorite novel, but he's an English teacher who's out of his depth.
Just for the record, how do you pronounce it? Because I think I mispronounced it at the top of this program. Somebody who knows, tell me how you say his name, please.
Well, Jenny knows best, right?
I say Nabokov.
Nabokov.
I say Nabokov, but I
think there's a boke in the middle.
There's a boke.
Yeah.
I had Alison Wood as a guest on the new season of my podcast, And because a lot is made in our conversation about how the teacher mispronounces it, I was like deep into like a, Google voice. Is it Boke? Is it Bach? It's definitely not the emphasis on the first syllable.
No, it's definitely. I mean, I mentioned the Sting song in my essay actually, but yeah, I think that's the most damaging thing because it has to, for the lyrics. It's like, it's young schoolgirl fantasy. I'm now messing up Sting's lyrics. It's a travesty, but some book by Nabokov. He uses it and that's, once it's in a song, it's locked in. Like that's it.
Jamie sang it, so.
Oh yeah. Yes.
You did on the podcast?
Yes, he did.
That's awesome.
And also, I fully was saying it wrong up until about a year ago. So to everyone watching who didn't know how to say it, don't beat yourself up about it.
It's really hard.
It's easily fixed.
It's hard. Oh my goodness. Well, I think that is a perfect note on which to end, except Jamie seems to be speaking, but I can't hear you. Jamie?
Oh, no, I wasn't. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
I wasn't. I didn't say anything.
Okay. Looked like you were. Thank you all so much for spending this evening with us. And Jenny, I have to wonder what your father would have thought of this discussion and that we're still talking about Lolita in such passionate terms and what a contribution to have made to the world. So thank you for sharing this and thank you for this. If you did not have an interest in purchasing this book, or this book before this evening's program, I hope you have changed your mind and that you will make those purchases, and thank you for that. Before we leave, I just want to say that one of the things about the Mark Twain House is that it was a writer's home and a home for writers. And every time we do one of these programs, I regret these virtual programs, we regret that we don't have you here in person to give you a tour of Mark Twain's house and spend some time with you. So you're now part of the Mark Twain family of writers, and I hope that you will come visit us in person as soon as it's safe to do so. And Jenny, congratulations on your book, and thank you all for being part of this. It's been a real honor and a privilege.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. This was
Thanks,
terrific.
everybody. What a pleasure.
Thank you. So nice to see
Good
you
night,
all.
everybody. Thanks
Good
to our
night.
audience for your great questions.
Yeah, they are great. I'm going to keep reading them.
Yep, they stay live after the program, and this is recorded. Good night, everybody. Thank you.